going to speak about Johann Siegmund Krüger. As he spent only 5 months in Herrnhut, he may not be a well-known character in Moravian history. However, these 5 months were enough to cause serious division and separation in Herrnhut. Kenneth Hamilton mentions Krüger in his History of the Moravian Church, and so does Gerhard Reichel in his History of August 13th, and Craig Atwood in Community of the Cross. And I know that Amy Godes-Lumen, a pastor of the Moravian Church, has written a play about August 13th, and Krüger plays a part in that. And I would be interested in playing him because he was really sad. But for us, he's important for various reasons. He is an example of the many wandering prophets that we find in Europe around 1700. His biography intersects with the Herrnhut community, and although his time in Herrnhut was only short, he played a critical role in the history of that community. Based on the archival record, we get a fairly good understanding of Krüger. 70 of his letters are preserved in the Herrnhut archives. Still, there remain many questions regarding this man. Next month, many Moravians will be celebrating the festival of August 13, 1727. This day marks the reconciliation between quarreling groups in the community of Herrnhut and is considered to be the spiritual birthday of the renewed Moravian Church. In this narrative, the reconciliation usually gets all the attention, much more than the division. For our understanding of early Herrnhut and the founding of the Moravian Church, it is crucial to know what the division and the dispute were about. The division that was resolved in August of 1727 was created by Krüger. An important concept for understanding Zinzendorf and early Herrnhut is Philadelphianism. Philadelphia, like the name of the city, means brotherly love. The Philadelphian movement began in England in the late 17th century. Philadelphians believed the established churches, including the churches of the Reformation, were corrupted and religious life was dead and cold. Philadelphia was the community of the true children of God, regardless of their denominational affiliation or their nationality, brought together in impartial brotherly love. They derive their name from the book of Revelation, where it is said to the church in Philadelphia, "I know your works. I know that you have but little strength, but you have kept my word and have not denied my name." These ideas were popular in England and in Germany among pious people who were critical of the established churches and went their own ways. We call them radical pietists, the pietists who did not stay in the church but separated. Philadelphian ideas were important in early Herrnhut. So what do we know about Johann Siegmund Krüger? Well, in fact, we have very little biographical information about him. We have no date of birth, nor do we have a date of death. And I'm grateful to Tom McCullough for trying to find this biographical information, but it is very difficult to search for someone with a name as common as Krüger. The little that we know can be inferred from his letters. I think he was born in a small village called Verschow in the Niederlausitz. At least, that is where we know that his father Balthasar lived. Krüger's wife was Johanna Sophia Schmidt. They had several children, but we do not know how many exactly. Krüger was trained in law. In 1724, he was a Oberamtsanwalt in Bautzen. This is comparable to a district attorney. Bautzen is a city 40 miles east of Dresden and 20 miles northwest of Herrnhut. In fact, travelers between Herrnhut and Dresden often passed through this town. Perhaps Krüger met Zinzendorf during one of his many travels between Dresden and his estate Berthelsdorf. And if they didn't meet, Krüger certainly must have heard about the young count who worked at the court in Dresden and who gathered religious people both at at his house in Dresden and on his estate in Berthelsdorf. And more importantly, Zinzendorf had a print shop on his estate. At the beginning of 1724, Krüger contacted Zinzendorf for the first time. Krüger wrote that he had written a treatise, Der christliche Mensch, the Christian man. As the book censors in Dresden did not want to release this treatise, Krüger asked Zinzendorf to intervene for him and to print the treatise in Zinzendorf's print shop in Berthelsdorf. But Zinzendorf was not willing to print Krüger's treatise, and despite Krüger's repeated requests over the following years, Zinzendorf never agreed to printing anything written by Krüger. Although Zinzendorf did not print the treatise, some sort of relationship developed between the two. Krüger visited Herrnhut in June of 1724. At that time, Zinzendorf asked him to inquire in Bautzen about a legal matter. In July of 1724, Zinzendorf offered Krüger a position in his household in Berthelsdorf. Although Krüger immediately accepted the position, Zinzendorf changed his mind and withdrew his offer. The reasons for this reversal remain unclear. Nevertheless, Zinzendorf found another position for Krüger at the court of his in-laws in Ebersdorf. In February of 1725, the Krüger family arrived in Ebersdorf to take up a position as legal counselor for the Reuss family. Why did Krüger want to give up his prestigious position in Bautzen and leave the city for Herrnhut or Ebersdorf? It is possible that Krüger's religious activities had complicated his position in Bautzen. One source tells us that Krüger at some time had become an object of ridicule when he tried to cast out demons by the laying on of hands with people in mental institutions. Perhaps this had taken place in Bautzen. Ebersdorf was a small village in Thuringia, 110 miles southwest of Dresden. This was where Zinzendorf's wife Herrnhut Reuss grew up. The Reuss family was a pious family. People from different religious backgrounds were living at the Ebersdorf court, and the devotion of the blood and wounds of Christ played an important role in their piety. Ebersdorf court life had made a deep impression on Zinzendorf. After he got to know this religious community, Zinzendorf was determined to establish a similar Philadelphian court community on his own estate in Berthelsdorf. For Krüger, on the other hand, life in Ebersdorf was not good. Soon after his arrival, he got into a long-lasting conflict with Heinrich Schubert, the local Lutheran chaplain to the Ebersdorf court. Soon after his arrival in Ebersdorf, Krüger showed the manuscript of his unpublished treatise to Pastor Schubert. This was the treatise rejected by the censors in Dresden and the one that Zinzendorf had turned down to print. An intense discussion ensued over the content of Krüger's treatise, and Schubert accused Krüger of Socinianism. Mainstream Christians considered Socinianism a terrible heresy. Socinians denied the doctrine of the Trinity and the divinity of Christ. Krüger, on his part, accused Schubert of lessening the importance of Christ's passion and death. Krüger claimed, contrary to Orthodox Christian teachings, that Christ died on the cross not as a human being, but only in his divine nature. Most Western Christians taught that Christ was both fully divine and fully human. This doctrine, according to Krüger, implied that Jesus died on the cross as a human. According to Krüger, this doctrine of the dual nature of Christ diminished the value of Christ's death. Both Schubert and Krüger were hotheads, not willing to give in, and the conflict soon escalated. We learn that Krüger was someone who lacked respect for both religious and secular leaders, something that easily got him into trouble within the strictly ordered society of the 18th century. In November of 1725, Schubert excluded Krüger from Holy Communion. Krüger was not impressed. He believed he did not need an ordained minister to have communion. This was a position that many sectarians of his time shared. You do not need the established church for these sacraments. Neither did you need the church to gain insight about God. From Krüger's letters, we learn more about his religious views. Krüger believed he had been born again through God's Spirit, who had entered him and driven out, quote, the seed of the evil spirit, unquote. Through God's spirit of renewal, a human being was able to abstain from sin, unite with God, and become similar to Jesus. Krüger wrote Zinzendorf that God revealed himself to him in dreams. One time, Krüger dreamed that someone was to come to Herrnhut to cause great confusion, quote, under the appearance of holiness. Only later did it become clear that Krüger was the person who would cause confusion in Herrnhut. During his time in Ebersdorf, Krüger developed objections against taking an oath. Many radical pietists were against taking an oath, something that often caused problems with secular authorities. For Krüger, his objections against the oath became a problem. He had taken an oath when he was installed as counselor to the Countess Reuss, but now he asked the Countess to release him from this oath. Furthermore, he refused to administer the oath to any subordinate officials. Krüger's position in Ebersdorf had become very complicated. Not only was he on bad terms with Chaplain Schubert, the Reuss family was confronted with a counselor who could not properly carry out his responsibilities. And then Krüger did something that caused his dismissal. As Krüger was not able to convince Zinzendorf or any other person to print his religious writings, Krüger took it upon himself to print his works. In March of 1726, Krüger had one of his treatises printed in the Ebersdorf print shop. The print shop in Ebersdorf was originally the print shop that Zinzendorf had established in Berthelsdorf, but that he had to move to Ebersdorf because of the pressure of the local authorities. For several years, the Reuss family, in close cooperation with Zinzendorf, printed books in Ebersdorf. Krüger, however, did not ask for permission from Count Reuss when he had the treatise printed on the Ebersdorf press. Count Reuss was furious and confiscated the printed pamphlets. To make matters worse, and in utter defiance of Reuss's authority, Krüger held on to some of the pamphlets, one of which he sent to Zinzendorf, when the authorities were gathering the outlawed copies. When Krüger refused to hand out these pamphlets to the authorities, he received his dismissal in April of 1726. Zinzendorf was pulled into the conflict at an early stage. He was the one who had recommended Krüger to his in-laws. Zinzendorf tried to play down the theological controversy between Krüger and Chaplain Schubert, and when Krüger was dismissed from Ebersdorf, Zinzendorf felt obliged to offer him financial support and work in Berthelsdorf. Did Zinzendorf suspect something was not right with Krüger? Zinzendorf knew that Krüger was not an easy person to deal with. At the beginning of 1726, when Krüger was still in Ebersdorf, Krüger, in one of his letters to Zinzendorf, had crossed class boundaries. Instead of addressing Zinzendorf with the correct title for an imperial count, he called him mein herzgeliebtestes Brüderchen. In order to understand the social faux pas, you have to understand a little bit of German. Brüderchen is a diminutive of the noun Brüder, meaning brother. In English, we do not have many diminutives, but in German, by placing the ending chen or line after a word, you can make it into something smaller or something dear. So I've been thinking about how to explain the effect the word Brüderchen must have had on Zinzendorf. I think in English, a similar effect can be accomplished by using bro. I think we can all understand that an 18th century count would not be amused when someone addressed him with bro. So that's what Krüger did. It was not uncommon among awakened folk to avoid class differences and use the equalizing term brother and sister, but Brüderchen, or bro, went a bit too far. It was typical for Krüger, who defied religious and secular authorities, to not apologize, even when Zinzendorf expressed his discontent about the faux pas. Krüger did not apologize, but instead questioned Zinzendorf's brotherly love. And not only did Krüger question the nature of Zinzendorf's brotherly love, Krüger wondered, when Zinzendorf sided with Count Royce about the publication of the pamphlet, if Zinzendorf was perhaps an obstacle to the extension of the kingdom of Christ. Zinzendorf must have realized that Krüger was anything but an obedient and humble subject. Perhaps Zinzendorf expected his stay in Herrnhut would have a positive effect on Krüger. Things turned out very differently. During the 5 months Krüger lived in Herrnhut, his opposition to both the secular and religious authorities in Herrnhut grew. In August of 1726, Krüger arrived in Herrnhut. He was by himself. He had left his wife and children in Verschow, where they lived with his parents. Herrnhut did not have the intended positive effect on Krüger. In a letter to his wife Herrnhut, Zinzendorf describes how Krüger, when Zinzendorf gave him a letter to copy, Krüger handed it back to him the following day, saying, quote, "His Father in heaven did not permit him to do that." Krüger, Zinzendorf reported, had gathered supporters who believed they received direct revelations from God. Zinzendorf called them imaginative souls. Local Lutheran pastor Rothe and Zinzendorf were the objects of Krüger's criticism and defiance. Krüger told his supporters they should not attend the services in the local parish church in Berthelsdorf. They should especially abstain from Holy Communion. According to one report, Krüger's supporters believed the Herrnhuters who listened to Zinzendorf and who attended the service in Berthelsdorf were worshippers of the whore of the apocalypse. Krüger's main supporter was Christian David, founder of Herrnhut, who had led many Protestant refugees from Moravia to Herrnhut. Christian David called Zinzendorf the beast and Pastor Rothe the false prophet. These are all terms from the book of Revelation describing the forces of evil opposing the work of God. In the book of Revelation, the whore of Babylon was an allegory for the opponents of the faith and stood for the Roman Empire. During the Reformation, Martin Luther used the image of the whore of Babylon for the Roman Catholic Church. Now, Krüger and his supporters applied the image to Zinzendorf and Rothe. By doing so, he accused Zinzendorf and Rothe to suppress the true faithful. Krüger told his supporters to stay away from the church in Berthelsdorf, where Rothe was the pastor and Zinzendorf the lord of the manor. It may be ironic that Zinzendorf was depicted here as a representative and protector of the Lutheran Church. Wasn't the Lutheran Church corrupted in the eyes of many radical pietists that Zinzendorf had gathered on his estate? Was Zinzendorf's religious community not a community that developed outside and separate from the established church? Did Zinzendorf not consider himself the protector of the true children of God? I think one can easily argue that Zinzendorf was a separatist and that the Herrnhut community developed into an independent congregation where Rothe, as Lutheran minister, had little say. But Herrnhut had not completely broken away from Berthelsdorf. Although Zinzendorf wanted to make Herrnhut into a Philadelphian community of true believers from all denominations, he still tried to keep Herrnhut connected to the Berthelsdorf parish. As local lord of the manor, who was trained in law and had a position as a counselor at the court of the King of Saxony, he knew that he could not disobey the law of the land. Rothe sympathized with Zinzendorf's Philadelphian ideals, but he was foremost an ordained Lutheran pastor, bound by his ordination vows. Krüger and his supporters criticized this halfway position in the sharpest terms. As we will see, Zinzendorf was open to this criticism, and during the following year, 1727, he established Herrnhut as a Philadelphian community separate from Berthelsdorf. But before we can discuss this, we need to look at Krüger's unfortunate downfall. Let us now turn to Krüger's apparent developing madness. The first accounts of Krüger's mental issues date from December of 1726. At the beginning of the month, Krüger had disappeared from Herrnhut for a couple of days, and when he returned, he was not doing well. Johann Christian Gutbier, the Herrnhut doctor, wrote this assessment of Krüger's condition. Quote, "For many days he has been rolling around in the dirt and soiled himself with dust. Bystanders had to wipe off the spittle coming out of his mouth, including the snot from his nose. Today he took his clothes off several times and made strange gestures. Meanwhile, he listens closely to everything that is being said, and when one tries to speak on the quiet, he starts to move around as if to show that he knows what is being said, which to me appears very worrying, as I have never seen anything like this. One moment he is very submissive, apologizes to the bystanders, that he does not love them, and kisses their feet and licks up the dirt on the ground. The next moment he complains that he has made peace with idolaters. End of quote. Krüger refused to take the medicine that Gutbier gave him. He did not eat or drink much because he suspected everything to be impure. He did not want to sleep in a bed and began to eat snow. Krüger thought by eating snow he was able to heal his heart torn by the devil. He kept taking his clothes off and repeatedly tried to escape. What appeared madness to Gutbier was something different in the eyes of Krüger's supporters. They stood by him as they considered his behavior an ultimate attempt of self-purification rather than a sign of mental illness. For them, Krüger used fasting and praying as a method to deliver himself from the devil. They believed Krüger was becoming Christ-like and was able to perform miracles. Dr. Gutbier saw something different. According to him, Krüger's situation deteriorated by the day. Sometimes Krüger started to laugh out loud while his body was shaking. Krüger stopped answering to his name and claimed his name is no longer Krüger but Tobias. Gutbier suggested to send Krüger to his wife. A collection was held among the residents of Herrnhut to pay for his transportation. On January 15, 1727, Gutbier wrote to Zinzendorf that Krüger was gone. Although Krüger was now gone, his supporters did not give up. Christian David now became their leader. Out of discontent, David moved into a small cabin that he had built just outside of the Herrnhut community. Others moved in with him. In February of 1727, one of Krüger's supporters, young law student Friedrich Klemm, sent around a circular letter in Herrnhut condemning Zinzendorf's authority. This is the division that tore up the Herrnhut community and that was eventually resolved on August 13th of 1727. In April of 1727, Zinzendorf took a leave of absence from the court in Dresden and moved to Berthelsdorf. On April 20th, Zinzendorf separated Herrnhut from Berthelsdorf. He left Berthelsdorf to Pastor Rothe, while upon himself he took the care for the Herrnhut community. In May, Zinzendorf introduced the Brotherly Agreement. The Brotherly Agreement gave the community in Herrnhut a formal foundation as a Philadelphian community, defined its distance to the parish church in Berthelsdorf, and established Herrnhut as a congregation led by lay people. In the Herrnhut diary, Zinzendorf wrote, "Christian David was right for the main part, but erred in the method. Therefore, it was necessary to agree with him." This formalized the position of Herrnhut as a self-dependent Philadelphian community, thus meeting the demands first expressed by Krüger and soon adopted by Christian David. What happened to Krüger after he was sent home to his family in January of 1727? He did not stay with his family for very long. He went on to Berlin, where he wanted to speak with the King of Prussia. He wanted to hand his Confession of Faith to the king, probably one of the treatises that he wrote. Somehow, Krüger was drawn to men with authority, but his encounters with these men were mostly unsuccessful. When Krüger came to Potsdam, near Berlin, he was, much to his surprise, confronted with his former adversary, Pastor Heinrich Schubert from Ebersdorf. Schubert had left Ebersdorf not long after Krüger's dismissal, when he was called as pastor at the new church built by the King of Prussia in his residence Potsdam outside of Berlin. At Schubert's instigation, Krüger was put into an insane asylum in Berlin. The Friedrichs Hospital in Berlin was an orphanage and a hospital, but also a place for people with a mental disease. He shared the room with another radical pietist, Victor Christoph Tuchtfeld. Tuchtfeld was a Lutheran minister who had lost his position because of his radical ideas and journeyed around as an itinerant preacher. The two self-made prophets, Tuchtfeld and Krüger, must have had interesting conversations in the room they shared at the Friedrichs Hospital. However, nothing seems to indicate that Tuchtfeld was suffering from mental disease. This begs the question, how insane was Krüger really? Herrnhut, Dr. Gutbier, Zinzendorf, and other leading Moravians labeled Krüger insane, mad, or crazy. Krüger's supporters saw something very different. They saw a prophet who went very far in self-mortification in order to purify himself and to become like Jesus. Krüger was definitely a restless soul. After he had been released from the hospital in Berlin, Krüger returned to Herrnhut on November 1st, 1731. Although he assured Zinzendorf that he need not worry about his future behavior, Zinzendorf did not let him stay in Herrnhut. Krüger left and went on. About 10 years later, he appeared in Ebersdorf, going around in rags, looking like a beggar. And this is the last thing we hear of him. Krüger was a tragic person. The label of insanity could make us underestimate his ideas, but his life, ideas, and the role he played in Herrnhut are important. He caused a division among the Herrnhuters that would last until the summer of 1727. By looking at Krüger, we got a better understanding of the nature of this division. Although the dispute was framed in extreme language borrowed from the book of Revelation, the conflict was about issues of ecclesiology. How was the Herrnhut community to see itself? Was it a true Philadelphian community, or was it to continue obeying to the religious and secular authorities of the time? As we have seen, Krüger's criticism was adopted by Christian David, led Zinzendorf to answer this question. In the Brotherly Agreement of May 1727, Zinzendorf defined the nature and character of Herrnhut as a self-dependent Philadelphian community led by lay leaders and only loosely tied to the parish church of Berthelsdorf. Later that year, on August 13, 1727, this formal establishment of the Herrnhut congregation was sealed by a religious experience that has since been considered the spiritual birthday of the Moravian Church. There's a lot more that we can say about the exact nature of that event, but that has to wait until another day. I thank you for listening to me, and if you have any questions, let me know. Thank you.